Strategy of attacking only merchant ships. Targets relatively easy to attack. He points out that destroying Britain's fleet of oil tankers would starve the Royal Navy of supplies needed to run the ships, which would be just as effective as sinking them. And in contrast to the years and enormous expense of constructing what he likes to call bloated surface ships, large numbers of U-boats can be built relatively cheaply and put to work in a short time. Rader wants a Navy with at least 8 battleships of what would become to call the Bismarck class, 50,000 tons plus and larger, and more powerful than anything afloat in European waters. Rader recommends to Hitler a 10-year naval construction plan that he calls the Z Plan. This balanced fleet, as Rader calls it, would be lopsided, with the bloated surface vessels that Dönitz scorns. Hitler tells Rader to proceed with his Z Plan, but to plan to complete it in 1945 rather than 1948. Rader has no reason to believe Hitler will start a war before 1945. By 1938, Dönitz is trying to impress upon Hitler the utter unreadiness of the German submarine fleet to have any decisive effect in severing Britain's Atlantic lifeline in the event of war with Britain. He explains why to keep 100 U-boats at sea will require a fleet of at least 300. His U-boats would lose time in action while leaving their bases, traveling up through the North Sea and around the tip of Scotland or around Iceland to get to the Atlantic, then back, all the while subject to attack from air and sea, and then for refueling, for repairs, for taking on supplies. They would lose time from sinking merchant vessels while waylaying mines and while training crews. They would be shorthanded for attacking shipping in the Atlantic, while numbers of them would be demanded in other parts of the seas. But with his new concept of wolf packs, concentrating groups of submarines for simultaneous attack on convoys, he can effectively sever supply lines from the Americas and Canada to Britain. Rader, too, sees war with Britain as a primary naval concern. In April 1939, Hitler tells Rader to set his mind at ease. He has the political situation well in hand, and England, he says, will never go to war just because of Hitler's demands for the return of the Polish corridor, as he calls it. Hitler also tells Dönitz not to worry and says under no circumstances would war with Britain come about. But when Hitler's tanks roll into Poland on September 1, and Britain and France declare war on Germany, Hitler's words of comfort to his concerned admiral sound hollow. And no longer can Hitler stop worrying about the direction of his navy. On September 3, Hitler scraps Rader's Z Plan for a balanced fleet. He orders that all work on capital ships not launched must cease. And for the moment, heeding Donitz's pleas, he orders that that the types and numbers of U-boats Donitz has requested be built as a matter of extreme urgency. In their books, each of Hitler's two stunned, surprised admirals recorded their reaction. Here is Donitz. I could not believe that Britain would be indifferent to our ever-growing strength. I believed, therefore, that war with Britain would soon be upon us, and I pressed with vehemence to accelerate the submarine building program. It was Hitler's complete misconception of British mentality that led to the Second War. So he found himself faced with a conflict he had wished to avoid, since, to quote his own words, it would inevitably result in the end of Germany. The Navy was like a torso without limbs. This is still Donitz. Only 22 U-boats were available for service in the Atlantic. That meant that only 5 to 7 boats on average could be actively engaged at any one time in the Atlantic. And the bitter truth is that this number was later reduced on one occasion to a couple of boats. War in 1939 should have been avoided at all costs. This is Rader's comment at the beginning of hostilities. At the beginning of hostilities, there were 22 British and French battleships against our 2 battleships and 3 pocket battleships. The enemy had over 7 aircraft carriers. We had not one. The Allied enemy had 22 heavy cruisers to our 2 and 61 light cruisers to our 6. In destroyers and torpedo boats, the British and French combined could throw 255 against our 34. Our only hope was concentrating all our efforts against the enemy's overseas supply lines. Seaborne imports were England's most vulnerable spot, and that was where we had to strike. No longer can Rader argue effectively with Hitler for funding of new capital ships to prey on enemy shipping. Here's what he explains. This is Rader. Hitler sharply disapproved of the directions for ships to avoid battle in order to perform their more important task of destroying enemy commerce and cutting the Navy's supply lines. With no appreciation for indirect effects, he held that the warships, especially the large warships, should be used primarily in combat with the enemy's fleet, while he approved of using submarines, auxiliary cruisers, and other light forces in war on enemy supply lines. He considered employment of cruisers and pocket battleships for this purpose to be barely justified, and of battleships not at all. Convinced that some few submarines could accomplish more at less expense, he little realized how the very threat of large ships could tie up the enemy's forces, spread his defenses thin, drain his supply system, forcing him to do convoying and, in general, keep him uncertain. What Hitler wanted was victories the whole world could see.